Hello, everyone, and welcome to David P. Morgan's Milwaukee, presented by Kevin P. Keefe and hosted by the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. My name is Haley Page, and I'm the Exhibition and Events Coordinator for the Center. In tonight's programming, we will hear from a great friend of the Center and one of our board members, Kevin Keefe. And I'm pleased to say that tonight's program has one of the highest registration rates we have ever received for our monthly online programming series at 475. Wow. So I guess that is the power of David Morgan.
Yeah, it's not me, it's David Morgan.
It's you too, Kevin.
and Kevin Keefe. So I'm going to run through some housekeeping information on Zoom webinars controls, and then I will be turning the mic over to our Executive Director and President, Scott Lotus. As I mentioned, we are using Zoom webinar for our presentation, which means that audience members do not have access to their personal audio or camera during the event, but you can change how you'd like to view the presentation in the top right corner of your Zoom screen. I believe the options are between speaker and gallery, and you can play around between those two options to see which one looks best on your own screen. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a number of icons. The two that you mainly need to worry about are the chat and Q&A functions. So the chat is where you will put any comments or observations or just kind of general chat that you have throughout the presentation. If you select all panelists and audience, that will ensure that everyone can see your comment. Please use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have for our presenter. Following the presentation tonight, we will have a Q&A session. And if you have any questions at any point throughout the presentation, you can just put them in there, and putting them in the Q&A, not the chat. That makes sure that we'll definitely have eyes on that for when we get to that Q&A at the end. Just a reminder that we are recording tonight's program, and that will be made available on our YouTube page early next week. And I'll just go ahead and drop that link into the chat right now. And I'll drop that in again at the end of the presentation as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Great. Well, thanks, Haley, and welcome everyone who's joining us tonight. I'm Scott Lotus, President and Executive Director of the Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's presentation by Kevin P. Keefe of David Morgan's Milwaukee, which I'm very much looking forward to seeing. Here at the Center, we've pivoted to online programming as so many organizations have. We do look forward to a return to in-person programming, which we are tentatively planning for this April 8th through the 10th in Lake Forest, Illinois for our annual Conversations Conference. We'll be having details and opening registrations for that on our website right after the first of the year. In the meantime, we look forward to continuing these online presentations throughout the winter and into next year as well. They've been wonderfully popular. We love the chance to reach more of you and to be able to offer more of these programs. So we look forward to continuing to doing these long into the future as well. And as Haley mentioned, you can find all of them on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/railphotoart. I believe this is the 25th online presentation we have made since the pandemic started. And there's more than 40 programs up on our website because several of these programs were multiple presenter events, and so each presentation is separate. We really appreciate everyone who's shared your work with us as presenters, and for all of you for tuning in to join us. It's really, really heartening to see the great interest in these. Besides that, we also continue to publish our quarterly journal, Railroad Heritage. Members should be receiving the winter issue in your mailbox anytime. And if you're not a member yet, all you have to do is go to our website, railphoto-art.org, to sign up, and we'll ship you out a copy and get you on the mailing list for those quarterly magazines. We're also shipping our new book now, The Railroad and the Art of Place, an anthology. Due to labor shortages at our distributor's warehouse, they are not able to ship those books out right now. So our staff here in Madison has actually taken on that task ourselves. We packaged up about 130 books and shipped them out on Friday. And we will continue to do that until the issues at our distributor's warehouse have been resolved. I really appreciate our staff members stepping in to help out with us at a sort of a critical time with the holiday seasons upon us. And if you have ordered a book or are about to, just know that we could really appreciate a little bit of patience as we get these out to you. We'll certainly do that as quickly as we can, and look forward to sharing all of our books with you. Aside from that, I'd just like to introduce our presenter tonight, a good friend of mine, Kevin P. Keefe. He is a member of the Center's Board of Directors and is a columnist and blogger for Classic Trains magazine. Kevin studied journalism at Michigan State University. He then worked for 11 years in daily newspapers and then spent 29 years at Kalmbach Publishing Company, where he was a member of the train staff for 13 years, 8 of those as the editor-in-chief. He later served as the magazine's publisher, and he retired from Kalmbach in 2016 as their vice president editorial. His book, 1225, The Life and Times of a Steam Locomotive, won the Notable Book Award from the Library of Michigan in 2016, and I have since had the pleasure of working with him on 2 more books, our title about Wallace W. Abbey's photography, published by Indiana University Press, and then our most recent, The Road and the Art of Place, an anthology published by the Center this year. It's always a pleasure to hear from Kevin, so I'll turn the mic over to him now. Kevin, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to you too, Haley. It's a privilege to be here tonight. 2 key points I want to make before we dive into these images. First, this program was originated a couple of months ago for the National Convention of the National Railway Historical Society, which met here in Milwaukee this year. And I knew that the audience I had that night for their banquet was probably, most people were not familiar with Milwaukee. Maybe a lot of them had never even been here before. So I thought it would be fun to kind of introduce them to the city that they were in, especially the city as it used to be back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Then I was looking for a way to make the tour more interesting, and I stumbled on this idea of somehow linking up going around Milwaukee with David P. Morgan, the famous editor of Trains magazine, who likely needs little introduction to our audience tonight. So having worked at 1027 North 7th Street myself for a few years, I thought I could sort of imagine what it was like to be Morgan back in the 50s and 60s when he was just getting his career rolling, and he would walk out the door on a summer evening on 7th Street and walk a few blocks south and then encounter all the incredible stuff that was going on in Milwaukee back in those days. Second point I wanted to make is I just wanted to make my own tribute to my adopted hometown of Milwaukee, which once upon a time was really one of America's great railroad towns. I think you'd have to travel pretty far and wide to find a railroad city with as much variety as Milwaukee had, and it's the kind of stuff Morgan witnessed every day. You might even say Milwaukee was kind of idiosyncratic as a railroad town. It had its Class 1 railroads, the Milwaukee Road and the Northwestern, but it also had other stuff like an amazing traction heritage, and then these quirky things like the beer line and these car ferries that sailed across Lake Michigan every evening to over to the state of Michigan. So in DPM's era, I think Milwaukee was one of a kind. And with that, we can delve into the images.
Okay, so Kevin, you're going to hit that green share screen button.
Oh, that one
and
right
then
here?
select the option of your PowerPoint.
Okay, select this one. Okay, and go to
Perfect.
presentation mode.
Yep.
Okay, good, great.
There you go.
David P. Morgan with a G, that's great. Train watching in the Beer City with Trains Magazine's editor, and I will get into the photographer credited with this photo in a little bit, Richard J. Cook. But here's David P. Morgan in a photograph taken in August 1947 with his characteristic camel unfiltered in his left hand, standing next to a Milwaukee Road steam engine at the station downtown. And I believe this was the weekend that he came up to interview for his job at Kalmbach with Al Kalmbach himself. In 1947, he was 25 years old. So there you go. Tonight, we're going to be wandering all around the city of Milwaukee, and I hope you can see my cursor moving here a little bit as opposed to a laser pointer. Kalmbach's building was right downtown here where it says TM Depot and Chicago North Shore and Milwaukee Depot. That's kind of the approximate area of where Kalmbach was. And we're going to spend the first part of the program wandering around in this part of downtown where all the big stations were. Then we're going to head east toward the lake. And then we're going to start wandering around the city. Now you'll notice the orange lines. These are the Milwaukee Road lines that kind of weaved their way through the city. And then the green lines are the other major Class 1, the Northwestern, which tended more to go around the city, including up the Lakefront line on your right along the shore of Lake Michigan, and then the freight-only bypass that went around to the left side of your map. one other thing I'd point out before we get into this, if you look down on the lower right, you'll see Jones Island labeled, and that's Jones Island wasn't really an island, it's actually a peninsula, but Jones Island will become an important location as we continue to roll through these photographs. So here we are, a building familiar to many people watching tonight, I think, the Kalmbach Publishing Company building at 1027 North 7th Street. It was built as a furniture factory in 1928 with thick reinforced concrete walls. In fact, I remember when I worked at Kalmbach in the 70s, there was one of those fallout shelter civil defense signs on the door that this was the kind of building you should go to if there's an all-out war. And Kalmbach moved into this building in 1943 and stayed there until about 1988. And here we have David in his office in that very building, taken in 1952. He is not the editor yet. I'm not sure quite why such a formal portrait was taken at this point. He was named editor in 53, but you'll see there the November 52 issue of Trains and Travel on his desk. I won't belabor this point, but many people probably recall that for a while in the early 50s, Trains was called Trains and Travel, and that was because that was an attempt by the company to try to market the magazine to a wider audience. Here's Morgan in his office from our Wally Abbey book, Scott. Morgan gathers the staff around him and Marilyn, if you look down at the glass top of his desk, in his office on February 28th, 1952. Standing behind him is associate editor Rosemary Entringer, later to become the managing editor and quite a legend in her own right. Then managing editor Wally Abbey, who went on to have a great career in railroad public relations, and editorial secretary Katie McMullen, who's probably unknown to most trains readers, but she went on to edit a magazine for Kalmbach, and that was called Better Camping, a magazine the company published in the late 50s and 60s. Now we jump forward another 15 years or so, and here we are in the late 1960s, Morgan and Entringer posing at the magazine's dictionary Lazy Susan, this wooden Lazy Susan that held this ponderous pile of dictionaries in the train's offices at the back of the 5th floor in the mid-60s, in a photo taken by the company photographer Art Schmidt. And if you knew Nancy Bartle, who also spent 40 plus years at Kalmbach and on the train staff, you see her way in the back at her desk. So when Morgan would walk out the door at that building, and if he headed south, took a right turn out of the door and headed south about 4 or 5 blocks, this is what he would encounter. This is the North Shore Line's Milwaukee Station at the corner of 6th and Michigan Streets. And this is a picture that Rob McGonigal found for me, which I absolutely love. It's a dazzling shot to me, partly because it really shows what the station looked like, and also because there's so much other stuff going on here. Just look at that classic architecture, the Insull architecture. It's unmistakable that this was a railroad owned by the Insull utility empire. You see the catenary overhead from the trolley buses. Apparently Michigan Street had been converted to trolley buses by this time. On your left, you see a Milwaukee Sentinel, the morning newspaper delivery truck, heading out to deliver newspapers. I like to see that because I was an employee of the Sentinel for 7 years. And then what really blows my mind is that billboard at the corner of the station advertising 38 fast trains daily to Chicago. Unimaginable today with Amtrak's 8 trains or 16 each way. So working our way through some North Shore photographs, here's a shot taken in the waning hours of service in January '63. Trainman John Horacek, who became quite well known as sort of a patron saint of the North Shore, attends to a Chicago-bound train of Silverliner cars. And this was taken by a Milwaukee Sentinel photographer. The Sentinel went out of its way to do kind of a big photo spread on the demise of the North Shore. Here's a shot of the same station a few months later, probably in the summertime, after it was abandoned and after it was closed. But I thought it was a really cool shot taken probably by Art Schmidt of Kalmbach. And a little note here that I will mention to you is if you look in the distance, you'll see a lighter colored building. It's kind of like the second building you see in a row with vertical square windows. And that was the state office building designed by Ted Rose's father, the artist, the railroad artist, Ted Rose's father. So, and then the other good news is that wonderful North Shore Line sign has been preserved at Union, Illinois by the Illinois Railway Museum. If you went inside the North Shore station, you'd find the lunch counter there. And I'd like to think that Morgan stopped in here once in a while to have a cup of coffee. It's a very kind of lonely picture knowing what's about to happen in a couple of days. If you went out behind the station, this is the scene you'd see looking north, kind of toward the Kalmbach building. You see the North Shore sign there just above the cars, and then a Schlitz sign right behind it. In a lot of these photographs, you're going to see the Hotel Schrader over to the right, which today is known as the Milwaukee Hilton. And then on the left is an early Art Deco skyscraper in Milwaukee called the Wisconsin Tower, with its phony dirigible pylon on the top. Today, it's a bunch of high-end condos. But here, the North Shore trains are coming out onto the 6th Street Viaduct across the Menominee River Valley. And a great shot of the cars of that era, including that spiffy-looking Studebaker in the middle of the photograph. If the photographer had turned around in that picture and faced the opposite direction, this is approximately the scene he would see. In this case, it's John Gruber, getting a photograph of a sailor, doubtless based at the Great Lakes Naval Base down at North Chicago, greeting the arrival of an electroliner at the throat of the North Shore Depot. Milwaukeeans downtown for generations got used to all kinds of young sailors, hanging around downtown on weekends on their weekend leave, and they all used the North Shore to get here. Here's a shot on that 6th Street Viaduct in June 1949. The viaduct was built in 1908, and it came down around 2003 when the current pair of bridges was built. Today, there's a couple of stay cable bridges that replace this. Interestingly enough, designed by Kaler Slater Architectural Firm, a firm we're kind of familiar with here at the center. And here we have an electroliner heading south across the 6th Street Viaduct in a great photograph by H.M. Stange and part of the Crambles-Peterson archive. Another wonderful Gruber shot. Now we're kind of following the electroliner south through the neighborhoods of south side of Milwaukee. Here, a Chicago-bound electroliner pauses to pick up passengers at 5th and Mitchell in June '62, just 6 or 7 months before the service was disbanded. I love this photograph because I think it says something about John Gruber's ability to recognize what's the most important picture. Rather than get out of the car and shoot the usual 3/4 angle of a train working its way down the street, I'd like to think that John knew the real story here was what motorists had to do to contend with the North Shore trains as they were trying to drive down 5th Street. Another shot by Gruber, taken around the same time, well, actually taken a couple of days before the service was ended. This is at the Harrison Avenue shops of the North Shore on that cold January night just before the whole thing came down. And today, the Harrison Avenue shops were long gone, long since torn down, and it's now a charter school, a brand new charter school. This is one of my favorite shots of the North Shore by George Crambles, the great George Crambles, the southbound electroliner soaring over the intersection of 6th and Oklahoma. And it just gives you an idea of how much money the Insel Empire threw at its electric railroads with that sort of infrastructure. Now, if you were to stand here today, you could clearly see the right-of-way on either side, all overgrown, but there's not a trace of the bridge anymore. And in the foreground, that empty lot you see there is a McDonald's. Big surprise. Now, I'm throwing this in there to take us right back to the North Shore Station at 6th and Michigan, just to show you what's there today. The North Shore Station was torn down not long after the railroad moved out, and it was probably an empty lot for many, many, many years. And in the early 80s, this building was built for Blue Cross Blue Shield. They later abandoned it. And now the story goes, this is the future home of Milwaukee Tool, which is a very successful manufacturing company. So Morgan spent presumably a certain amount of time at the North Shore Station. And then if he turned left and headed east on Michigan Street about 2 blocks, he would encounter this wonderful small urban park in downtown Milwaukee, alongside of which was the great public service building of the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, now known as We Energies, our big utility here in the state of Wisconsin. And all those folks sitting across there on those benches probably aren't paying very much attention, but you see the interurban cars poking out of the tracks that run through the bottom of the building, heading off to places like Sheboygan or Kenosha or Watertown or Burlington. The building was built in 1905 for the electrical company, and it's since been fully restored. And here's what it looks like today. The park is now called Carl Zeidler Park, right downtown. It's a pretty little park, a great place to hang out. And one thing I like about it is the way they saved, in a sense, they saved those big garage doors where the interurbans poked out and put in those kind of old-fashioned green doors, which to me is sort of an homage to the building's earlier role as the attraction terminal. So if Morgan was facing east in this photograph and he turned slightly to his right, the next thing he would see is this wonderful sight, the front door of the Everett Street station of the Milwaukee Road. And you'll see in a few minutes some really great photographs of this giant rock pile of an old station. What I love about this picture is the way that the Milwaukee Road in the 1930s pasted on Art Deco typography onto this 1880s building. I'm not sure it works, but it's pretty cool. And here's what you'd see if you were standing there now. The We Energies Annex offices occupy the site of the old Everett Street station. And I would say that's quite a step down architecturally. If you went inside, or if Morgan went inside, this is what he would encounter. This was the Milwaukee Road's home ticket office in Milwaukee, and it was long the workplace of Jim Scribbins, very prominent trains author. He wrote the great book Hiawatha Story, and then he wrote the 400 story. He spent many, many years as a ticket agent in Milwaukee and later worked in the PR offices of the Milwaukee Road in Chicago. Well, here's the real glorious stuff. When Morgan headed outside and just walked a couple of 100 feet to the east, he could have this view of the train shed and the station and a water plug that still existed. This photograph was taken around 1950. F7's leading the morning Hiawatha at the east end of the train shed. And it's notable to me that the steam water plug is still in evidence here. And this photograph was on the cover of Scott and my book about Wallace W. Abbey, A Life in Railroad Photography from Indiana University Press. If the photographer, if Wally in that case, turned around and looked toward the south, he could get a shot similar to this. Here we have a beaver tail observation car bringing up the back end of the morning Hiawatha, winding its way through the remainder of downtown before heading off to Chicago. And that car was designed, the streamlining was designed by the great Otto Kuhler. Everything in this scene now is mostly occupied by the I-794 freeway corridor. If the photographer turned around and faced to the northwest in a shot here from 1938, this is the same car, or one of the same cars, coming into Milwaukee on the afternoon Hiawatha. And here you get a nice view of the Hotel Schrader in the distance and the back of the Public Service Building. A glorious shot from the west end of the station along the crossing of Clybourne Avenue on an afternoon when there's a heck of a lot of activity going on with the Milwaukee. In the foreground, we have what's likely the Chippewa Hiawatha pulling out of town behind a streamlined Pacific. On the left, a Fairbanks Morris Erie-built cab unit is on the head of some kind of local train. To the left of that, a fairly new diesel switcher. And then beyond that, it looks to me like, getting up ahead of steam, one of Milwaukee's A-class 442 Atlantics, their fastest steam engines. But look at all this stuff going on here. And you just hope that that little kid on the red bike on the right is paying attention. Go to the opposite side of the train shed. Around the same time, although a lot less activity, here's train 10 from Green Bay has arrived under the train shed behind a Fairbanks Morris Erie-built cab unit. And there's a steam switcher working the express tracks. Another shot in about the same spot, this one taken by Lynn Westcott, longtime editor of Model Railroader magazine and one of Al Kalmbach's first employees. A flagman was used to protect all the multiple grade crossings down there because there were so many trains coming and going and so much automotive traffic. They needed a flagman to make sure everything was safe. Now, you might remember that photograph at the beginning of the program showing David standing next to that A2 class 442. Here is a full shot of the engine with David, taken August 30th, 1947, again on that day that I'm imagining was the day he interviewed for his job with Al Kalmbach. And just a quick note about the photographer, Richard J. Dick Cook was one of our great shooters. He was an early shooter of steam and diesel transition stuff in the 40s and 50s, widely published, did a very influential book in the 60s called Rails Across the Midlands, had a long career as a public relations editor and manager with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. And his stuff is now in the collection of the Allen County Historical Museum in Lima, Ohio. I love this shot. I love the whole idea of what were called set-out sleepers, in which a sleeping car that was going to be tacked onto the end of an incoming train would be opened up for passengers to board earlier than the arrival of the train. In this case, this is the set-out sleeper Gallatin River, built in 1948. I looked this up because it was an unusual configuration. It's an 846 Pullman, which means it had 8 duplex roomettes, 6 regular roomettes, and 4 double bedrooms. And I love this shot. It's probably taken around 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. I just like this idea of climbing on board a single car. It's all hooked up to the steam. It's very cozy. And at some point during the evening, the Pioneer Limited would pull in from Chicago. They'd tack your car onto the end of the train, and off you'd bound for the Twin Cities. Not far from there, a westward view, a switcher approaches the 6th Street Viaduct. That's the bridge the North Shore crossed, on freight-only track along the south side of the Menominee River. And this is still a very busy freight line into the West Milwaukee yards of Canadian Pacific. Now we're heading a little bit south of there, but not very far. Here, a westbound Hiawatha behind F7s comes rolling into town at Florida Street, a half-mile south of the station. And a note for modern train watchers, if you look to your right down there around that curve just past that Midwest Transit trailer, there's a wonderful little Irish bar called O'Lydia's, and it's a great place to hang out and watch Amtrak and CP trains coming and going. But you won't see this train, unfortunately. Here's a shot just a little bit further south of that of a Milwaukee Road 464 leading a Chicago train through the south side. I like the shot because it's just a great action shot. You can just imagine the noise that engine is making. Plus, I like the idea of the Milwaukee Road not calling its 464s Hudsons. They called them Baltics. This is a lovely shot at what is a pretty well-known railfan hangout for Milwaukee people at Waterford Avenue on the south side in what used to be called the town of Lake. Now it's part of the city of Milwaukee. This looks very rural here. It's not rural at all anymore, but this train is heading south toward Chicago. It's climbing the hill toward Lake in November 18th, 1951. And I think it's a terrific train picture. And it was taken by Art Schmidt, the company photographer, who wasn't known for taking a lot of train pictures, but for whatever reason, Art was out that day. I think he got a lovely shot, especially when featuring that Milwaukee Road home-built bay window caboose. Now we're going to move over to the lakefront and get off the Milwaukee Road for a while. And the Milwaukee Road station was nice, but certainly the gem of Milwaukee, the greatest station, at least in my mind, was the Chicago Northwestern's Lakefront station. And here you get a little glimpse of it. We'll see more of it in a second. In a wonderful color shot of a Pacific moving a train out of the depot in the early 1950s. Almost everything in this photograph is gone now, but if you do come down Prospect Avenue and take that sweeping curve to the right onto Wisconsin Avenue, that still kind of looks the way it is. There's a lot of park space there around that curve. Sad to say, though, everything else that's railroad oriented here is long gone. Here's a shot from the south end of the train shed at the Northwestern station, showing the Twin Cities 400 on the left and the Peninsula 400 meeting at the lakefront in the 1950s. This is the only shot I've ever seen of the interior of the lakefront station, looking down into the waiting room, down the staircase that brought you down to track level from up on Wisconsin Avenue. And there's a lot of atmosphere in this photograph, but I especially like the lit Twin Cities 400 sign over the doorway out to the train shed on your left. Here's my favorite shot of the station, a great shot again by Wally Abbey, taken in June 1951, of the westbound Twin Cities 400 at the Lakefront station. Lots of stuff to see here, especially if you're a Milwaukeean. You can see the station, you can see the train shed. If you look over on your left there, you'll see an airstrip, a runway, of a small municipal airport. That site is now the site of the grandiose Summerfest grounds, the music festival grounds that are occupied all summer long by music festivals and ethnic festivals. In the distance, you see smokestacks associated with the Milwaukee sewage treatment plant, which will come up later in the program. But what you don't see here is the bridge over the mouth of the harbor, now known as the Hone Bridge. So I went out there a few months ago and took a picture of in the exact same spot that Wally's standing in, and this is what this is what it looks like now. Almost nothing is recognizable from Wally's picture. You can see the bridge over the harbor in the distance, and you can sort of get a hint of the Summerfest grounds. And you might be able to say that Lincoln Memorial Drive that the cars are on are kind of following the tangent of the Northwestern tracks. Maybe you can say that. Just north of there, we see a shot approaching the Lakefront station, the Peninsula 400, taken in the late 1950s, coming into town on what we know as Milwaukee's east side. And if you went to the other side of the station, the south side, and looked to your south, you'd see a fairly sprawling area of coach yards, engine terminal, and sidings for local businesses, many of them in the perishables business, on what's known as Milwaukee's 3rd Ward. Now you can see the Lakefront station in the middle. That's that dark spire just to the left of the telegraph pole. But in the distance, you can see a white terracotta apartment tower. That's still there. Right in front of it is a hotel that's long gone. But over on your left, that boxy kind of imposing building is the earlier headquarters of Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance. But you can see how the Northwestern dominated the Milwaukee Lakefront back in the day. And I don't know how the city felt about it at the time. I think it's wonderful myself. I wish it was still there. Here's another great shot taken near the same location, pointing more toward the northwest. You see a heavy Pacific rolling out of town with a troop train in September 1951 in a photograph taken by Al Kalmbach himself. And you see that Northwestern Mutual Insurance building just kind of behind the smoke box of the steam engine, but then off to the left is a wedding cake Art Deco office building that's very much there today. In those days, it was the headquarters of Wisconsin Gas. Here's a shot taken near the roundhouse that was in the same engine terminal. I've never seen a photograph of the roundhouse, but I know it was there. But here's a shot taken at the Sand Tower by Lynn Westcott again, the great model railroader editor, of a 282 getting a fresh supply. To the southwest end of all that activity, all the tracks came to a point here where they crossed the Milwaukee River on a swing bridge. And here's the only shot I could find of that swing bridge back when it was in railroad service. And here we say a Northwestern switcher bringing a cut of cars across the Milwaukee River during a heck of a blizzard. And you can see the grain elevator on the right. That is still there today. In fact, here's what the whole place looks like today. And this is one of those good news stories. If you're going to lose the railroad, then let's at least do something like this. And here the city of Milwaukee and other organizations have seen to it that they've created a vest pocket city park at the same location. It was obscured in the snow picture, but you can see the tower there that controlled movements in and out of the Erie Street yards and across the swing bridge. And I'm told that tower has been restored and is going to be opened as a bed and breakfast, which is a pretty cool idea. And you can see the grade crossing signal that's been moved to a different location, obviously. And then the swing bridge is being left in place, probably by the Coast Guard. So a really neat small place to hang out and just get away from it all in the middle of downtown Milwaukee. Now we're going to move around other parts of the city. Let me see, I'm going to forget where we're going to go. Okay, we're going to go down along the harbor now, and I'm going to show you some stuff involved with the car ferry operations near Jones Island and around the Kinnickinnick Basin, which you see in the lower right of your map here. If you drove down Kinnickinnick Avenue, it's hard to say, before the 1950s, you'd see this sign, this wonderful neon sign showing you where the Pierre Marquette's car ferry dock was on the inner part of the harbor. And I can only imagine how many times Morgan might have driven down KK and pulled into this driveway just to see one of the boats coming in. If he did, this is one of the things he'd see. Here's the Pierre Marquette's City of Midland ferry, has arrived in 1942, and it's being worked by a Northwestern switcher, pulling freight cars off the City of Midland. Later on, and I don't know the exact date, I've tried to find it and I couldn't find it, the Pierre Marquette and later the Chesapeake and Ohio moved its ferry operations across the harbor to what we earlier identified as Jones Island. And here we have this wonderful 1920s classic architecture of the Pierre Marquette 21 ferry leaving Milwaukee. And you can see in the background one of the main buildings of the Milwaukee sewage plant. And one of the things notable about this photograph is it was taken by C.P. Fox, who many people in Wisconsin know as the great founder of the Circus World Museum in Baraboo. And Chappie Fox spent a few months as a Trains magazine staffer in the late 1940s. Here's a shot at the same spot taken 20 years later by Scott Hartley, a Connecticut guy. And here we see the city of Midland backing up to the dock in June 1977. I'm sad to say that the city of Midland, which was my favorite of the C&O car ferries, was cut up into a barge 20 or 30 years ago. It's the hull still exists, but only as a barge. And here's my favorite car ferry shot of all, taken by my former boss, Dave Ingalls, showing the great 1953 streamlined C&O car ferry Badger, now under the tutelage of Chessie System, departing Milwaukee in October 1980. And I give credit to Dave for getting this shot because he almost certainly was standing on the Hone Bridge to get it. And the Hone Bridge is not a place you normally want to stop and get out of your car. There's no place to stand that's legal, that's for sure. But this gives you a great sense of the west end of the east end of the Menominee Valley and the industries that line the harbor. And 6 hours later, this boat will be landing in Ludington, Michigan. Now we move to the other railroad that had extensive car ferry operations in Milwaukee. And here is the Grand Rapids of the Grand Trunk Western loading at the GTW dock on the KK River. And I have some notes here about this locomotive. That's a Brill diesel. It was built in 1926 for the Long Island Railroad, which was under pressure to drop steam on some of its branch lines. But this unit didn't work out too well, and it was sold to Grand Trunk Western in 1934 and converted completely to diesel. And Grand Trunk found a perfectly good use for it on Jones Island, pulling freight cars out of the various Grand Trunk ferries. But here's a wonderful shot of the city of Milwaukee, Grand Trunk's most beautiful car ferry, the last of the classic unstreamlined vessels. It was built by Manitowoc Shipbuilding in Wisconsin in 1930. And the good news is the boat still exists today as an events venue over in Manistee, Michigan. So you can go see it. Now we're going to move back to what's known as the east side of Milwaukee, which is north of the Lakefront station. This is near my neighborhood, actually, where I live. Jim Scribbins got this great photograph of the Peninsula 400 hustling out of town north for Green Bay. And it's going underneath Prospect Avenue, and it's approaching what we know as Farwell Avenue on the east side. Much of this scene looks exactly the way it does here, except for the railroad and except for the trains. The right-of-way is now hosts the incredibly popular Oak Leaf bike trail. If you go farther up the Oak Leaf bike trail, eventually you'll get to this wonderful scene, although it doesn't look like that anymore. Here we have Train 214, the Ishpeming Chicago Peninsula 400, hustling over Capitol Drive in Shorewood. That's the first northern suburb of Milwaukee in July 1954. A great shot by Jim Scribbins. I love the way the Northwestern used its bridges most railroads did, to promote their passenger trains. Sad to say, this deck bridge was torn down about 15 years ago and replaced with a very handsome bicycle bridge. But Shorewood did have a train station back in the day, left out of the picture up on the right-of-way. Move farther north now into the northern edge of Milwaukee, here at a place called Wiscona, which was an interchange between the Milwaukee Road's line north to Michigan. That's what you see disappearing in the distance. And then across the breadth of the photograph, the Northwestern's line to Sheboygan. After the two stations were closed in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Road Everett Street Station and the Lakefront Station, both railroads combined in what they called a Union Station, what we all know now as the Amtrak station in downtown. And this forced the Northwestern to bring its trains onto the Milwaukee Road at Wiscona, and they would come down through the center of the city to get to the new depot. And here's a great shot of the train arriving in 1967 with bilevels. Same photographer, Phil Stemo, who I don't know much about, took this photograph in 1963, shortly before the discontinuance of the westbound Twin Cities 400 crossing over the Milwaukee Road near Mill Road on the Milwaukee's north side. And really nicely composed photograph. Some more Northwestern stuff. On the far northwest side of Milwaukee is the little suburb of Butler, which is home to the Northwestern's main freight yard here in the Milwaukee area. And here in a shot in 1950, a company photograph, we see an H-class 484, the largest locomotive on the railroad, arriving in Butler. This is the engine that Trains ran a big article back in the 70s. Wally Abbey or someone christened it an H of an engine, because it really was. We're going to flip now to the far south side of Milwaukee, to the little suburb of St. Francis, and the major interlocking between the two main lines coming up from Chicago on the Northwestern. The Lakefront line, which the Peninsula 400 is sticking to, and then off to your right, you can see the line to Butler swerving away to head west and then north. And this photograph was taken from the tower at St. Francis, as you'll see in the next photograph, where we see the same train hustling away to head into downtown Milwaukee. And although there is still a track at this spot that leads to Jones Island, much of what you see here in the foreground has been dug up for the 794 Parkway, an extension of I-794 that takes you from downtown south to the airport. So the junction is still there, but it certainly doesn't look like this anymore. Same place, a giant Northwestern H8 484 leads a southbound freight at St. Francis. And I looked it up earlier today. These were reputed to be perhaps, or at least among the heaviest 484s on any railroad in the United States, which is kind of a cool distinction that the Northwestern could claim. Now we're going to move, let's see where we're going to move next. Okay, we're going to head back to the east side of Milwaukee. We've been down here. St. Francis is here where we were just looking at. We're now going to jump up to the lower east side of Milwaukee, and we're going to explore what's known as the Beer Line. This was a line that came down off the Milwaukee Road's original railroad that went west from the city, wandered down along the Milwaukee River to a point right here, if you can see my cursor, where three of Milwaukee's big breweries were concentrated. The Blatz Brewery was right here, near here on the other side of the river. And then on the west side of the river was the Schlitz Brewery, which was huge, as well as Pabst. And all three breweries used team tracks and then of course the Schlitz, in the case of Schlitz, its own sidings to bring grain in for their brewing operations. Here was the yard that served the beer line. A great shot of Milwaukee Road's Humboldt Yard, so named for the street you see going from left to right in the background. That's Humboldt Avenue. This is a view looking west. And when I first moved to Milwaukee in 1974, this was still there. And I remember driving around the mostly residential east side and all of a sudden bumping into this really cool, crazy scene of Milwaukee Road diesels and freight cars and everything else going on. Now what you see in the foreground is a parking lot for the Pick and Save grocery store. And if you look along the river in the distance, all that industrial stuff has either been torn down and replaced by, or has been redeveloped as, luxury condominiums and apartments. So this whole part of town has a vastly different look to it. Although if you look at the distance, you can see a couple of familiar landmarks. That boxy building with columns and kind of left center is the Milwaukee County Courthouse. So this yard served the beer line. And here's a shot deep into the beer line, just a quarter mile west of there, showing a Fairbanks Moore switcher working the beer line near Pleasant Street in a photograph by Wally Abbey. And you see the Pabst Brewery grain storage facility on your left. On your right, the gleaming white buildings of the Schlitz Brewery. On your right, almost at the top of the picture, you see what that castle-like parapet, which was a shoe company. There was shoemaking and leather tanning was a very big business in Milwaukee throughout much of the 19th century and early 20th century. And on your left is a tannery that now, I think that one's been torn down, but those are the kind of tough old industries that the beer line was created for, beer and leather. This is probably the most famous or widely seen shot of the beer line. Wally Abbey got this wonderful portrait of a Fairbanks Moore switcher pausing beneath the Holton Avenue Bridge over the Milwaukee River. And actually, this scene today looks a lot like this, save for the railroad tracks and the locomotive. Of course, they're gone, but some of this creosote timber trestle work here that's supporting the tracks remains. And I have to believe it's been saved by the people who redeveloped this area just as sort of an homage to the days when the beer line meant a railroad, not a neighborhood. And here's what it was all about on the beer line, serving the breweries. Really wonderful photograph by Wally, showing boxcars of various railroads spotted deep inside the Schlitz Brewing Complex. Illinois Central, Union Pacific, New York Central. And I believe this is one of the buildings that has been saved. It has a different mural on it now, but much of the Schlitz complex is still there, and it's been redeveloped as a very nice office complex. Now we're going to switch over to the west side of downtown, the southwest side of downtown, and catch up with some traction. Here we see a Milwaukee Electric car descending to street level at 8th Street, which is right on the edge of downtown. Everything in this picture is gone. I don't see anything in here that's still there. In fact, much of what's in this photograph is probably occupied today by Interstate 94. But the Milwaukee Electric ran a legendary extensive interurban operation. This interurban is probably coming in from Waukesha, given the latter era of the photograph itself. And I wish I could tell you who took it. But I can tell you who took this one. This was Bill Middleton's shot of another Milwaukee Electric interurban coming into town on the so-called rapid transit line near what is now American Family Field, the home of the Milwaukee Brewers, which would be in this picture if it existed, then off to the left. And as you'll see in some other photographs coming up, many of these huge high tension towers still stand, obviously built to carry electrical power out to the western suburbs, but also built to accommodate the double track of the rapid transit line at the bottom. And more than a handful of these still exist along I-94 as you drive west of downtown Milwaukee. A little further west, 4 or 5 miles, you get to West Junction, which was a junction where the Milwaukee Electric split into a couple of different lines and also shared an interchange with Chicago Northwestern. You see the track kind of cutting across the photograph in the background. That right away is the Northwestern's line to Wales and to Madison. In the distance, we see a train heading for Hales Corners, heading away from us. And in the foreground, a train from downtown is on what they call the turnback loop. And this photograph was taken by Willard Anderson, or Andy Anderson, who was an early editor of Trains magazine and later worked on the model railroader staff for many, many years. Now we're going to switch from interurbans to streetcars. This is a great shot taken from the Wisconsin Avenue Bridge near the Miller Brewing Complex. And you're looking across the Menominee River Valley toward the brewery. And in the foreground there, you see this magnificent double-track streetcar bridge that crossed it connected one end of Wells Street to the other end of Wells Street, basically from the city to the suburb of Wauwatosa. And then below it, you see some wonderful activity on the Milwaukee Road. The Wells Avenue line was abandoned in 1958. So I have to believe this photograph was taken not long before that, based on the paint scheme of that Milwaukee Road diesel. And then, of course, associated with the brewery, you see a whole string of refrigerator cars right beyond that. Here's what it looked like at the west end of the bridge as a number 10 streetcar came off the trestle onto West Wells Street, with a nice view of the Miller Brewery in the distance, and all kinds of really interesting warning signs about crossing on the bridge. Generations of Milwaukeeans, and you still read about it today on occasion when Milwaukee history is discussed, generations love to ride across this trestle because to a lot of Milwaukeeans, this was one of the more exciting things to do, was ride across the valley. This is what it looks like today. The Miller Brewery is still there, of course. The Class 1 railroad tracks are still there, of course, now Canadian Pacific. But in the middle of it was this void that used to be the Milwaukee Electric Streetcar Line. I took this photograph a couple of years ago, standing on virtually on the same bridge. If you went to the end of the Wells Street line, you got to the end of the line at Harwood Avenue in the suburb of Wauwatosa. And here's a shot of one of the streetcars that are standing. Some of you, if you visited Milwaukee in the past, you might recognize this area. The area of the streetcar station is now a municipal parking lot, but you see a little grade crossing there on the right side, just behind that car. That's now a pedestrian grade crossing that leads you to the village of Wauwatosa, which has a fabulous selection of restaurants and bars and that sort of thing. And kind of running all through the middle of it is the Canadian Pacific. In fact, here is a shot in Tosa on what is now Canadian Pacific, but then was the Milwaukee Road. And here we catch up with Morgan again. Here's DPM contemplating a westbound local at the Watosa Depot. And this depot was built in the 1940s in kind of a sturdy semi-Art Deco style. It replaced, unfortunately, a fabulously Rococo Victorian frame station that used to be there. I guess I can only imagine the station had fallen into disrepair. So the Milwaukee built this station. But this station's also long gone. You won't find it there. This is now a parking lot for some of those restaurants I mentioned. And just west of this, oh no, excuse me, we got one more before that, taken nearly the same spot by just turning about 180 degrees, we see an incoming train. It says westbound, but I think I have this wrong. I think it's an eastbound train arriving at Milwaukee behind E6 diesels. Again, another shot by Dick Cook. And for all I know, this was taken on the same weekend that he was here to visit David P. Morgan when Dave had his interview with Al Kalmbach. Great shot. And the Pony Truss Bridge you see on the right is still there, right next to a restaurant. You can watch Canadian Pacific freight trains and Amtrak's Empire Builder cross through here. Just west of Wauwatosa is the suburb of Elm Grove, which, interestingly enough, was the last place that Dave Morgan lived in his latter years. A very affluent little suburb. And it used to have a very nice little train station, which you can just sort of see a little piece of to the left. The station was torn down in the 60s, and it now is a laundromat occupies the same spot. But the tracks and everything else looks pretty much the same, including that grain elevator in the distance. The city of Elm Grove has retained it as part of a kind of a historical redevelopment, which is kind of neat. But here we have the eastbound morning local, which came in, I believe, from Watertown, Wisconsin, and gave people a chance to almost use it as a commuter train into downtown Milwaukee. We're going to return to the map now because I wanted to point out a couple other things we're going to see. And that is we're going to return to the downtown area here and revisit the Milwaukee Road yards, which was one of the biggest things in the city. You couldn't miss it. If you drove anywhere around Milwaukee in its downtown area, eventually you'd run into this vast industrial space, some of it filled with slaughterhouses and other sort of industrial things, but the railroad was the big thing in the Menominee Valley. And here's a great shot taken, I would say in the it might be the 1940s, late 1930s. It's amazing to me, the color quality of it. What we see here is the afternoon Hiawatha leaving town behind an F7-464, one of the fastest steam engines ever built, arguably. And in the foreground, the engine terminal at 35th Street. And I think I did a count and I came up with something like 14 steam engines, most of them live in this photograph. Some of what you see in the photograph is still there. Of course, the CP main line on your left still curves around there to head west of town, just like you see. And in the distance, you see those tallest high tension power lines. Those are those same Milwaukee Electric towers that held the catenary for the rapid transit line. Just beyond them, you can see several gas holders that are long gone. Over on the right is a huge industrial complex known as the Falk Corporation, F-A-L-K, which is still there. And then in the distance, the 27th Street Viaduct, which you can still drive across today. Great photo, and I don't know why it's credited both to Lynn Westcott and Al Kalmbach, but together they did a heck of a job with this photograph. Near the same spot, I have a mistake to point out in the caption. I've since learned that the Soo Line steam engine on the left is not a 484, it's a 482. 484s were not allowed to come down into Milwaukee. Standing next to a Milwaukee Road 484, 260, just one number off our excursion favorite, the 261. Nice shot by Jim Scribbins. Soo Line used trackage rights on the Milwaukee Road to get some business down here in the city. And they came off their own line. They came off the Soo at a place called Rugby Junction, which is about 30 miles north of Milwaukee, where the Soo Line and the Milwaukee ran next to each other for a few miles. So this is how, back in the day, the Soo Line accessed Milwaukee. Now we're back with Morgan in a very bittersweet photograph. Here David is in a very lonely scene, walking along a row of dead engines taken at 35th Street in the late 1940s, I'm guessing, maybe around 1950. And that picture you saw a couple of shots ago, I'll go back to it here, that wonderful shot of the afternoon Hiawatha behind an F7 with that wonderful orange and maroon consist behind it. Well, this could very well be that very same engine just a few years later, left for scrap. And everything about this is kind of sad for me. Morgan doesn't look like he's enjoying himself all that much. And boy, that wonderful steam engine just looks terrible. You do see the 27th Street Viaduct in the distance, which is still there. And oddly enough, you see the smokestack of Thiele, T-H-I-E-L-E, tanning. And Thiele Tanning is still in business in the same location. Here's a shot near the same place, looking west now. Not the greatest photograph, but it shows some cab units bringing in a passenger train. I'm not sure which train it is. It's probably the Olympian Hiawatha in the morning. It gives you a hint of the large complex that was known as the West Milwaukee Shops. But what's most interesting to me is in the distance, you see brand new County Stadium, probably not long after it was built in 1953 or 1954. Back then, the home of the Milwaukee Braves of the National League. And County Stadium now is long gone. You'll see its replacement here in a moment. Wally Abbey got this artful shot standing on the 35th Street Viaduct, looking down on the 35th Street Terminal at one of the two, I think there were two roundhouses down there. Much of the roundhouse was torn down, but Wally had an eye for artfulness, and I thought this was a really interesting study of shadow and angle. Another shot by Wally, telephoto shot looking west, showing another part of the engine terminal and what was left of the roundhouse. And beyond that, I believe those were the wheel shops of the Milwaukee Road, that long building that kind of cuts left to right. But there was also everything else there. There was upholstery shops. There were obviously locomotive erecting halls, all kinds of stuff. It was a complete railroad facility. And in the distance, once again, you can see County Stadium. And over on your left, one of the wonderful 1870s or 1880s Victorian buildings of Soldiers Home, which was one of the big original convalescence facilities for veterans. Still there. Well, here's what that area kind of looks like today. So you can see that that County Stadium's long gone, has been replaced by the dome of American Family Field, known up until the last year or so as Miller Park. And the CP main line on the right. And you can still see one of those Milwaukee Electric rapid transit towers just to the right. And finally, before we're finished, another shot at Grand Avenue, the tower that looked down on the Junction right near Miller Brewing. Once again, we see the streetcar bridge in the distance. Over on your left, I have an eastbound freight swinging into town behind a Milwaukee Road steam engine. In the middle of the picture, a bunch of reefers, probably destined to go to Miller Brewing. And over on your right, Grand Avenue Tower, the tower that controlled the whole thing. This is a wonderful photograph, and it's a company photograph. Often publicity photographs from railroad companies didn't have this much flavor. But this really gives you an idea of what there was to see in Milwaukee back in the day. And I'm sure this is something that Morgan saw many times. And I like to think he probably even spent a little bit of time down in the tower sifting through 19 and 31 train orders. So with that, we've reached almost the end of our program. I have one last photograph of Morgan. This is one of my favorites, taken in 1978, credited to Rosie Entrenger, his beloved managing editor. And this is the David I remember from my 2 years at Kalmbach in the mid-1970s before I left and then came back later. And this was David's office on the 6th floor at Kalmbach. And that photograph behind him of a Southern train on Saluda still hangs in the new Kalmbach building out in Brookfield. And David looks just great in this picture. And with that, I want to thank the center for asking me to do this tonight. And I want to give a special shout out to my colleague and friend, Rob McGonigal, just retired the other day as editor of Classic Trains magazine, who helped me find a lot of the images for the program tonight. So with that, I'll turn it back to Scott or to Haley.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Let me see if I can. Can you stop sharing? Do you know how to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, you want me to hit the stop sharing? Just hit the green. Oh, stop share. I got it. Stop
there
share.
you go.
Where'd it go? Did I hit it?
Yes.
Okay, good.
No, that was great. Well done.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done. And thank you for taking us on a tour of my beloved hometown and
That
so
you
many
never knew
views that I've
existed,
never-
right?
Yeah, exactly. And I want to remind everyone to send in any questions they may have for Kevin in the Q&A. We'll go through those over the next few minutes or so and try to get through as many as we can. As just maybe to start, Kevin, as some context, can you talk about how much train activity Milwaukee still sees today?
Well, it's not negligible. It's not like there's nothing going on here, and not to be negative about anything, but you compare it to what we just saw, and it's just incredible what we don't have anymore. But this is still a good railroad town. I mean, we should be very grateful for 7 trains a day to Chicago, and then the 8th train, the Empire Builder, to Seattle. I'm guessing that the Canadian Pacific is running, I don't know, around 20 freight trains a day through town. Fewer than they were a few years ago with the advent of precision scheduled railroading, longer trains and fewer trains. But the CP main line, the old Milwaukee Road main line, is still very much in business and fairly busy. The Northwestern is still busy, not the Lakefront line, of course, that's a bike trail. But the line that goes west of town and up to Butler still sees 3 or 4 freight trains each way a day, I'm guessing, maybe on a busy day. We still have coal trains that go up to Sheboygan from the Powder River Basin 3-4 times a week. And then there's regular freight trains who come up from Proviso and Chicago to serve Butler and beyond. So there's that. And then, of course, not very far away, if you just go 15 miles west of Milwaukee, you get to Waukesha and that area out there where the Canadian National Main Line, formerly the Sioux Line, comes through. And that's pretty busy. I think they see 25 trains a day through there, judging from what I've seen. Milwaukee has a streetcar line now called the Hop. It's about 2¼ miles long. It's just a pale shadow of what used to be here, but you really shouldn't judge it on that basis. I like riding it, and I think it's cool, and I hope it expands. So we do have that. And then we have probably our premier short line is the service we get from the Wisconsin and Southern, a Watco-owned short line based in Horicon, which comes down into Milwaukee every day to take big trains in and out of the city. So there's lots to see here. But lots less than there used to be, and no car ferry. Well, there's a ferry that goes to Michigan, but it won't take any railroad cars. There's the Lake Express, which is a wonderful ride across Lake Michigan, twice as fast as the old railroad car ferries.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a
never ridden
snapshot.
that ferry.
Have you ridden it?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's fun, especially on a rough day.
Yeah.
Maybe
There's a reason.
Maybe a
There's a
future
reason why
us.
the Lake Express has barf bags in the back of the seat ahead of you.
Oh.
I'm serious.
I was just about to suggest a staff field trip, Kevin, but you may have talked him out of it.
If it's a calm day, it's a wonderful ride because it goes about 39 knots. I mean, it gets across the lake in 2 hours, and it takes the ferry up in Manitowoc to get over to Ludington 4 hours. So it's twice as fast, but it doesn't contend with heavy seas as well as the Badger does. That's for sure.
Hey, Haley, before we get too far into the Q&A, why don't you let the people around that are still on know about what's coming up with the beer line exhibit?
Sure. Yeah. So Kevin showed a few images of the beer line that were taken by Wallace Abbey and that are in the center's collection. We have a small traveling show called Milwaukee's Beer Line showcasing these prints, and that is going to be on display at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, starting this January, opening January 28th, and then that's going to be up all year until next January 2023. And I believe they're having an opening exhibition event on that 28th, 5:30 to 7:30. In addition to the prints from our collection, they're also going to be displaying a model of the beer line train, I believe donated from Model Railroader magazine, and a few other maps and beer-related memorabilia of the 1950s. So if anyone's in the area, definitely come check it out.
Thanks.
And if you have lots of money, you can live on the beer line and buy one of those fabulously expensive condominiums.
Well, Kevin, we've had I hope you had a chance to look through the chat. It's absolutely blown up with comments of praise and thanks, and we really appreciate those, everyone. Thanks for sending those in. We've got some questions in the Q&A as well. One about the photograph by Elwood Pite, I think is the last name. And someone was asking whether his material's in the Center's collection. It is not. Do you have any idea where?
That was the Baltic.
Yeah.
Going flat out on the south side. I never ran into that guy's name before, and I haven't seen it since. I mean, that's the only picture I know of. There might be more in the Kalmbach library files. I had never heard of him before. I don't know who he was, but he was good. I mean, it's a really cool photograph. I just don't know. And there was very little, in fact, there was no caption information on the back. I think it was Mike Reyes, one of my friends who saw the program Friday night in Fox Point, kind of figured out where it was because he was able to read the milepost number on the code line pole, which was 82. Right. So that put it at about Chase Avenue on the near south side of Milwaukee, right near where the big Clement sausage factory is, which is also classic Milwaukee, isn't it? We have 2 sausage factories in Milwaukee, you know, we can't just have one.
Yes, very, very German. Someone's curious about going back to the beer line real quick. We obviously have some pictures of that in the Abbey collection. Do you know if there's pictures of those that exist in any other collections, maybe a Kalmbach?
Certainly Kalmbach, yes. Although if you leaf through the prints we have at Kalmbach, I'm retired, but I'm going to say a lot of them are by Wally, but a lot of other photographers associated with trains and the Kalmbach staff took pictures on the beer line. I think there's some pictures by Dave Ingalls and probably by George Drury. Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, you could do a whole program. You might be able to do an entire hour-long program just with photographs from the Kalmbach library, let alone anyone else who has pictures. The beer line was really cool. It's almost like the ultimate railroad you can model because it's a class 1 railroad, but it weaves its way through such tight confines that no matter how small you pack in your model railroad, it still kind of looks realistic. That's kind of the way the beer line looked.
No, it's a fascinating piece of railroad.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Kevin, our friend does. Oh, go ahead, Haley.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say our friend Steve Glashinsky is on tonight, and he's just curious about, Steve is curious about why the Northwestern Depot was torn down.
Well, I think it was torn. This is kind of maybe a cop-out answer, but I think it's accurate. I think it was torn down because it was closed too soon for anybody to be around to know how to save it. I read today, in fact, it was today I was doing a little bit of homework for my captions. There was an effort that I wasn't aware of to save it, but I imagine that the people that wanted to save it were so underfunded and so politically unsavvy that they couldn't muster an effort to do it, because the station, certainly the railroad didn't want it anymore. I believe the station was conveyed either to the county or the city. I'm not sure about that. Rob McGonigal could probably tell me, but whatever happened, it was 1967 or so, and it was just too soon. Now, Milwaukee has a pretty decent preservation movement, and in more recent decades, we've done a pretty good job of saving some important buildings. But in 1966 and 67, there just wasn't the political wherewithal to get it done. And of course, that was, for a city like Milwaukee, that's prime real estate. I mean, what's Milwaukee without Lake Michigan? It's just another Midwestern city. The lakes really, the lake's the name of the game, in my opinion.
No, it's certainly a defining characteristic.
Yep.
Charlie Hunter was wondering about who's originating and terminating freight in Milwaukee these days.
Well, I don't feel terribly qualified to answer that, but there are certainly plenty of cars coming in and out of the yard on 35th Street, the old North Milwaukee Yard. I mean, Wisconsin and Southern brings this, Scott, they bring a big train into Milwaukee every night, and later on in the wee hours, they take a big train back out. And, but originating traffic, well, there's a lot of traffic on Jones Island. We should say that right away.
Right.
There's a fair amount of traffic in what I perceive. There's a lot of tank car traffic, some of it in grain and maybe plastics, some of it in some kind of petroleum products. Trying to think what all it comes in there, but there's a fair amount. Elsewhere, I imagine Miller Brewing still gets some business.
That's they do. Yeah, and actually, really... John Kelly looked that up, but they do still get, I think, inbound commodities come into the brewery. They don't ship out beer anymore, but they get some inbound raw material still.
Right.
Yeah, perhaps.
And Haley, we had someone. Oh, go ahead. We had someone looking for for the link to the to our YouTube channel. If you could drop that in the chat again, or actually, I could do
absolutely.
That too.
Okay. I was going to direct this next question perhaps to both of you as a representative of Kalmbach, even though you say, as you say, Kevin, you're retired, though you still refer to each other as we, and Scott as a representative of the center, but whose collections and photography would you most be able to see of the lines between Milwaukee and Green Bay of either the Milwaukee Road and the Chicago Northwestern?
Well, the Kalmbach files certainly have a lot of pictures of that line. There are all kinds of photographers in all kinds of conditions. I don't know that line had signature photographs that really kind of stand out among other photographers. The beer line had a bunch of photographers, mainly Abbey, who did such a great job on it. I imagine Jim Scribbins had a lot of photographs of the line up the lakefront toward Green Bay. And I think Jim's photographs now reside, well, I'm not sure where they reside. They reside with Mike Schaefer, Scott, perhaps?
I am not, I should know that, but I'm not positive, Kevin.
I forgot. But Jim Scribbins was he was a Milwaukee Road railroader through and through, but he shot everything. But actually, now that you ask, Haley, I would tell this person that I think actually the Lake Line, both lines that went up to Green Bay, either through Appleton or through Sheboygan, at least as I've seen it in the Kalmbach Library, are relatively underrepresented photographically.
I would agree with that, Kevin. I know we have a little bit in the John Gruber collection at the center, and I think Abbey got a few trains on those lines, but and we might find more in John's. We're still, I think we're processing 1966. So we have a lot of material to go there, but if Abbey has any, it's not very much.
Yeah. Part of it was probably just train frequency fell off so much north of Milwaukee, even back in the day, that it was harder to go out there and depending on what your life situation was, work hours or whatever, and know that you'd get something.
Kevin, Thomas Haley mentioned that Morgan's writing in trains actually inspired him to pursue what ended up being a 36-year career in railroading. And he's just wondering if you could just say a little bit more about Morgan and what kind of person he was like.
Well, David was, he was known to be very, very shy, and he often made a rather unimpressive impression when people first met him in public settings. In fact, when he gave a speech, I loved his speeches, but even when he gave a speech, he just looked right down at his notes and didn't move, and he read it slowly. But it didn't matter because what he wrote was so wonderful. And he had this wonderful Georgia accent, this croaky accent that, you know, let's face it, had been modulated by decades of camels. It was wonderful to watch him read a speech. In the office, he was a different guy. He was funny. He was witty. He gave as good as he got. He liked to tease. He used to make fun of Ingalls and me a lot because we were Michigan guys. And he gave the impression that he thought Michigan was pretty much a waste of time as a railroad state, which of course got us riled up into quite a state. So he was that kind of guy you could kid around with. He also knew that Ingalls and I and Mike Schaefer and some of the other folks that worked at Kalmbach in the 70s, we were all just huge Chicago rail fans. We loved Chicago. Chicago was the railroad capital for a reason. And Morgan, whether he was kidding or not, he used to scoff at us and say that Atlanta was a thinking man's Chicago. So, which I always, and he said it in that Georgia accent. Morgan was a quiet guy most of the time. And when he was working really hard and concentrating, you kind of wanted to stay away from him. But out in the hallway and just chatting over a drink or something like that, he was really a charming guy. And, you know, this person who called in or who sent a message in was influenced to go into railroading. And that's one of the things that makes me most proud of Trains' legacy as a magazine, was to me the astounding number of people who read the magazine and then made life and career decisions based on what they read in a paper magazine. I just think that's rare. I've met hundreds of rail fans, readers over the years who went into the industry partly, not completely, but partly influenced by Morgan. And I'm the other one. I go the other way. I'm in this. I chose the career I have because of Morgan. Now that was journalism, not railroading, but it's the same idea.
No, I mean his writings inspired so many of us over multiple generations. I mean, anytime I want to get inspired for good railroad writing, all I have to do is pull down a copy of The Mohawk That Refused to Abdicate, and it's right there.
You can't say this about a lot of writers, and I certainly would never say it about myself, but with Morgan, you can actually just pick it up, and no matter how many times you've read it, you read it again just for pleasure, not to be informed, not to learn anything, just for the pleasure of reading the prose.
It's just fun to read. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned this already, but someone was asking, and I forgot too, but where the Dick Cook negatives wound up?
They are with the Allen County Historical Society in Lima, Ohio.
Lima, that's right.
Sounds like not a very major museum, but Allen County has done a great job of preserving the industrial heritage of Lima Locomotive Works. And probably for that reason, they also managed to pick up the Cook collection at some point. And I don't know how well organized it is, but they should do something with those pictures and start cranking out some books, because Dick Cook was a hell of a
Those are some great photographs.
Yeah, he really was good.
You pulled out a lot of gems for this, though. I mean, I like to think I'm somewhat well versed on Milwaukee photographs from what we have at the center, but I saw some that I had not seen before today that blew my mind.
Yeah, I found some nice surprises for myself too doing this.
We have a question too about the Milwaukee streetcar system, just whether there's any how it's doing, and the modern iteration, how it's doing, and whether there are any plans to expand it.
Well, the Milwaukee streetcar, a 2.5-mile line from the Amtrak Intermodal Station, weaves its way toward the northeast through some very important parts of downtown to the Lower East Side. I like it. I think it was very cleverly planned to hit some important residential neighborhoods and also spark some development. How healthy it is, it's hard to say. I mean, right now the fare is $0. I mean, you ride for free because
it's still free.
Yeah, it's still free. I don't know for how long, but it's still subsidized by the Potawatomi Bingo Casino. And they of course are able to put their brand on all the cars. You know, some days when you drive around town, there's nobody on them. Other times they're very busy. Of course, right now, it needs to be a bigger system.
Mhm.
And until it grows, at least with a couple other lines, it's not really going to come close to reaching its full potential. It all depends on how you feel about the streetcar. A lot of people in Milwaukee think it's a ridiculous waste of time. I utterly disagree. A lot of other people love it. It's hard to judge it though in quantifiable terms. Ridership certainly was hit hard by the pandemic over the last year and a half. Meanwhile, if you know where to look, there's a lot of evidence of the old Milwaukee Electric railway system here in Milwaukee. Not so much in the streets anymore. It's very hard, almost maybe impossible to find any tracks or anything like that. But there's several substations, substantial brick substations scattered all over the city, most of them with the great TMERNL company sign above the doorway. And then over on the west side of Milwaukee, near the Miller Brewing Company, are the huge Cold Spring shops of the Milwaukee Electric. They're totally intact. It's a big industrial facility that did all the maintenance and repair of all the interurban cars and streetcars. And under the asphalt pavement there, you can still see some of the tracks coming in and out of the building. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to ride the hop yet. I think it's a great idea, and it's always good to have more public transportation, especially when it's accessible. But yeah, it really does just stay in the central downtown area. I think they would do themselves justice by expanding out to some of the some of the neighborhoods beyond just the
Right.
center.
I agree. I mean, that would be wonderful. They got to find the money for it. There is one line that's already in, that's not served yet. But as soon as they finish building this big condo complex on the lakefront called the Couture, there's going to be a transit station in the bottom of the Couture. And this line will finally enable people coming into Milwaukee on Amtrak during the summer, let's say, to get off the train, get right on a streetcar, and take you right to the front door of Summerfest on the lakefront. And I think that'll be quite a draw, you know.
It is a challenge building these new streetcar systems because, I mean, what do you need to make them work? You need density and you need frequency, and those both cost a lot of money.
Yep. However, and you know about this parking lot, Haley, there's a parking lot in the 3rd Ward, right when you cross St. Paul Avenue to go across the river, and it's kitty corner from the Milwaukee Public Market. Well, you know, there's a big open lot there. Well, a few months ago, there's a 30-story apartment tower that's going to be built on that empty lot. It's going to change the face of that part of the skyline. I think it's 30 stories or 28. Wow. It's huge. And the developers, one of the reasons they cited for that location was it's right next to the hub. So I love that, because that to me was one way to send a message to all the naysayers. Millions of dollars of development. That's really the name of the story.
Yeah, I guess it's good in the name of development. You won't be able to see the public market from the river anymore.
By the way, I just got a text from my ever vigilant colleague, Rob McGonigal, who tells me that the shot of Morgan at the Wauwatosa station, I don't know who I credit it to, Wally Abbey, it was taken by Philip R. Hastings.
Well, interestingly enough, someone had written in a Q&A about that. And I had thought that maybe they were standing side by side, Hastings and Abbey. But if McGonigal says it was Hastings, I'd say it was probably Hastings.
No, in Rob's inimitable way, he'll be delighted to tell me that I made a mistake.
Better you than me, Kevin.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Well, Kevin, someone's curious about the Everett Street station, if there are any other photographs that you know of other than the one that you showed in your presentation.
Well, specifically of the interior, though.
The interior, yes, thank you.
Well, I'd have to go back and look. I'm sure there are some. That one I used because it was spoon-fed to me by Rob McGonigal as a color photograph. If I went through the black and whites, yeah, we could probably find some in black and white. I went with that one just because it was color. Yeah, I'd like to. That's a good question. Next time I'm out there, I might go digging around to see what else there is, because I really don't know what it looked like inside. But then again, the shot that I showed you of the Northwestern station too, that's the only photograph I've ever seen of the interior of that station. And I'm sure it was a handsome interior. It was a beautiful building. Good question.
We also had a question, Kevin, about Al Kalmbach's original slides. Do you know the whereabouts of them?
I know that they went, I believe, they went to somewhere in Chicago. I want to say Black Hawk Films, because Black Hawk Films would assemble them into various slide sets that you could buy back in the 60s. And I remember as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, still starting to read trains, reading about Al Kalmbach's slides and available in sets. I think the news is bad, though. In recent years, Rob and I and JDI and others, we've mounted various efforts to try and track down what happened to Al's slides. And I think we always reached a dead end. And I believe the last time we talked about it, we all just decided to wave the white flag, and we've kind of decided we're never going to find him. Sad to say.
Yeah.
Kevin, someone's curious about if you have a favorite David Morgan article.
Oh boy. Well, I could pick one, and of course it's kind of almost a cliche to pick this one. It's so obvious, but it's hard to beat that story from 1956, The Mohawk That Refused to Abdicate and Other Tales. I mean, quite apart from the title of the book, that was originally the title of one of his articles when he was out chasing steam with Hastings. And that story is still stirring to this day. But I also loved another latter day one. In fact, it might have even been the one that the last story he ever wrote for trains. I think it was called Look Away, Look Away. I'm not sure. Late in life, not long before his health began to fail, David and Margaret, his wife, took a car trip down through southern Illinois and farther into the South to kind of rediscover some of the places that he had written about and experienced back in the 50s. And he wrote a terribly poignant story about it. And it was published in 89 or 90. If somebody wanted to look it up, I won't delay the proceedings tonight by looking it up. But it made me cry. You know, it was a very sad story because he didn't live long after that. It's almost like he knew he wasn't going to be around much longer when he wrote this story. Great writing.
Oh, all of his stuff's just fantastic.
Yeah.
Tom Burke asked about a presentation on the railroads of Madison or Green Bay in the future. Kevin, I don't know that we certainly don't have enough stuff in our archives for Green Bay. We certainly do for Madison. And actually, Tom, if you go on our YouTube channel, the presentation I did recently about John Gruber has one section about Madison, easily could be expanded to a full program in itself. But there's at least a nice 6 or 7 minute portion of that presentation about John's 1960s Madison photography.
Yeah,
I think a program on either place would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as we continue to digitize the Gruber collection, I'm sure we'll definitely have enough to have an entire
Well, we have a few other collections too. Tom Mickelraith has some really nice Madison stuff from the late 60s and early 70s too. So yeah, that's probably something we should do at some point. Kevin Bond's asking about the electric buses in Milwaukee. Was there any connection to the railroads with those?
Oh boy, well, it would be rude of me to get right near here in my bookshelf. I have a book about the electric bus era in Milwaukee, and I should consult it. I don't know. I know that some of the routes of the electric buses obviously followed the same routes that the streetcars went down, but I'm not even sure when the electric bus era was over. We moved to Milwaukee in 1974, and there were no electric bus routes by then. There were still some of those cool old buses from the early 50s, diesel buses.
Sure. Yeah.
But I don't know the answer to that. But the CERA in Chicago, well, here it is. Let me grab it real quick.
And while Kevin does that, I saw a question. Oh, go ahead.
This is a great book called The Trackless Trolley Eras, a Milwaukee Transport Era. And this whole book is nothing but electric buses in Milwaukee. Oh, it was published by Interurban Press, not CERA. So I'm sure out there on the collector market, you can find The Trackless Trolley Years, a Milwaukee Transport Era.
We had a question in the chat about our our conference in April in Lake Forest, and at the moment we're planning to do that live in person. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to offer a virtual component simultaneously if we do it live. That takes a bit more technology than these Zoom presentations. It's something we'll look into, but I'm not sure if it'll be cost effective or not. If we're not able to do that presentation in person, then we would plan to fall into an online format. So that's the plan, at least right now, subject to change over probably multiple variants in the next 4 months, but we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Right. And we have tentative plans to open registrations for that in early January, and we'll put announcements of that on our website and send out announcements on our social media as well.
Well, and Kevin,
go ahead, Scott.
Well, I just saw, and just a reminder, if you have questions, do try to put those into the Q&A. I see a couple more in the chat, but there's been so much activity in the chat, it's hard to keep track of questions there. But I did see someone ask about whatever became of rail photo service, which is something I'd be curious about too, if you know, Kevin.
Well, I used to know, I've sort of forgotten it. Back in around 1988 or 89, Ingalls had me write a story about rail photo service for our erstwhile magazine, Trains Illustrated. It kind of faded away. In the late 40s, these guys, many of whom were in New England, kind of banded together in this, what I would call a collective, perhaps. And they sort of formed this photo bureau where they would go out and shoot photographs and somehow run them through this office in Boston that was run by, I think, by H.W. Ponton.
Yes.
And there was no money exchanging hands, I don't believe. But if you look through the Trains library, certain railroads in certain years, like from 1947 through about 56, you look at the back of a lot of prints, you'll see a lot of that familiar blue stamp rail photo service. Then they just sort of faded away. I just think it was one of those things where a combination of kind of a loss of enthusiasm, changes in people's lives. I'm guessing these guys were probably in their 20s or 30s in the late 40s, early 50s when they had this great idea to have this big photo bureau. And then when life confronted them, it couldn't last much longer. But they did some great stuff.
Well, incidentally,
I think Gene Huddleston was even signed up with them for a while.
I was about to mention that, Kevin, because in the new book, well, the recent book that came out about Gene Huddleston that the C&O Historical Society published, they mentioned that he got hooked up with rail photo service pretty early on in his photography career. And my understanding is that he was paid at least something for his, or maybe they bought film for him and gave, I think they may have bought film for him and gave him, he sent the film in, they sent him prints back. It was I'd have to look, it's in the introduction for that, to their book. But the upshot of all this was that when the CNOHS wanted to get Huddleston's negatives, they ended up getting them from the Rail Photo Service collection. And apparently they were in pretty rough shape at that point from all the handling they had been through there. And required a lot of digital restoration for them to be able to use. I don't know if that's all the case, but for everything there. But that was the story for Huddleston stuff.
And anytime any of those guys were published in Trains anyway, they got paid for that. I mean, they weren't being paid by Rail Photo Service, but certainly Trains always paid for its photographs.
Right.
By the way, I have another note to mention. My colleague Rob just got in touch with me. If anybody's interested in that poignant, wonderful last feature story by Morgan, it was called "Early on One Frosty Mornin'," and it appeared in the September '89 issue of Trains. And anybody who loved Morgan, and if you have archive access digitally to Trains, or if you have back issues, go look for September '89 and read that story. Just make sure you got a box of Kleenex handy.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Rob. We appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll bet Rob didn't even have to look it up. He always knows that stuff.
Probably not. Well,
what do you say, Matt? We're at just over 90 minutes. Maybe time to start wrapping it up.
No, I think so. Yeah, and thanks for all the great questions that you sent in. We got to most of them at least. And Kevin, thanks again for just a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyable trip through Milwaukee.
That. It was a lot of fun. It's it's always fun doing these, and I'm pretty relaxed. I really enjoy it. There's the give and take just makes it that much more enjoyable. It's always great working for you, Scott, and for you, Haley. And Haley's just great because she makes what to me is sort of this almost incomprehensible technical stuff just work so beautifully. So no, it was a lot of fun. Glad to do it.
We are very fortunate for Haley's very quick mastery of Zoom and everything else in this virtual world we find ourselves in now.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks
Good.
again, everyone, for tuning in. And I believe this is our last online show for 2021, but we'll certainly have more programming coming up in the year ahead. You can find out more about that on our website and social media channels. And have a great holiday season, and we'll see you next year.
Yep. Thanks,
Good night,
Kevin.
everybody. Thanks a lot.